Polyhedral dice. Why are they? Dice! They come in all these different shapes, but did you ever wonder, why do you know that? The answer is Dungeons & Dragons. Well, okay, but how did that happen? The story begins at the dawn of time. The oldest ancestors of modern dice are knucklebones, which evolved into both jacks and carved six-sided dice, the oldest ones dating back to about 5,000 years ago. Four-sided dice show up as part of the royal game of which was probably an ancestor of backgammon. And the oldest known 20-sided die dates to Ptolemaic Egypt, with similar dice showing up in Asia and around the Mediterranean. But then, polyhedral dice basically vanish, and it's just 2,000 years of cubes. With a few exceptions. Maybe as dice stopped being used for divination and became increasingly exclusive to gambling, it was just harder to prove that non-cubical dice were fair. Many-sided dice were odd novelties, but nothing to stake real money on, so 2,000 years of cubes. And yet, here in the future, we all know what polyhedral dice are, so you have to ask, what changes? One word: plastics. And so, in 1960, Yasushi Ishida develops a set of 3 20-sided dice for the Japanese Standards Association. Numbered 0 through 9 twice, they can be used to generate random 3-digit numbers. Plastic allows people to mass-produce polyhedral dice that are so reliably balanced that they can be used to generate random numbers for an engineering standards bureau. But unfortunately, Yasushi Ishida is not the reason why you know what the D20 is. In 1963, the inventor Fredda Sieve, who ran a company that produced plastic advertising novelties, patents dice based on the 5 regular polyhedra, which she called polyspheres, for a game that she designed called Zaz, which is basically Yahtzee. This is the first known game that calls for all 5 polyhedra to be used together. Unfortunately, the game doesn't sell very well, and it might have only been created to support the patent, so Fredda Sieve 2 is not the reason why you recognize these dice. It's 14 more years of cubes, and then, in 1977, TSR followed up the unexpected success of D&D with the Basic Edition rules. Aimed at attracting younger players, TSR included a set of 5 plastic polyhedral dice instead of selling them separately, as they had with their 1974 edition. The 10-sided die shows up in 1981 with the revised basic rules, and with that, polyhedral dice get locked in as pop culture objects. But maybe you're wondering, how did polyhedral dice get to D&D? Well, like so many stories about gaming technology, this one has its roots in the military. In the years after the Civil War, the U.S. Army commissioned Strategos, a fancy tabletop war game that officers could use to train in military strategy. In the 1880s, simulating realistic battlefield conditions meant cross-referencing a bunch of spreadsheets and doing math, then rolling some dice to determine uncertain outcomes. But we tend to think of chance in percentages, and those don't map very neatly onto 6-sided dice. So Strategos suggests using a 12-faced teetotum, a kind of top or dreidel, and ignoring any results of 11 or 12 to determine common percentages. And then, 80 years later, a burgeoning middle class full of veterans from the Second World War and the approaching centenary of the American Civil War causes a boom in recreational wargaming as a civilian hobby. In 1958, all the fun of cross-referencing spreadsheets while doing math crashes into living rooms and middle school chess clubs across America with the unexpected success of Avalon Hill's Gettysburg. Newly created communities of wargaming nerds start making zines and get heavily influenced by the Cold War popularity of game theory, which gets a lot of teenage nerds thinking that if you cross-reference enough spreadsheets, you could make a military simulation so accurate that it could avert nuclear war. In Minneapolis, a wargamer named David Wesley goes looking for statistics in old military manuals at the university library, where he finds a copy of Strategos and notices its reference to a 12-faced teetotum. Wesley was trying to figure out what a teetotum was when he remembered his geometry teacher had some plastic models of the Platonic solids, and he assumed that the book was talking about a dodecahedron. Wesley found an educational supply catalog and talked his friends into pooling their money and buying a few sets. At first, they just used the 12 and 20-sided dice for rolling percentages, but eventually they started creating all kinds of house rules for the other dice. And then, in 1970, Wesley, who was in the Army Reserves, was called up for duty in the Vietnam War. Assuming that he wasn't going to be coming back alive, Wesley gave all of his gaming stuff to a friend who had provided the basement where most of their games had been held. That friend was David Arneson, who went on to co-create D&D with Gary Gygax, releasing the first edition in 1974 while Wesley was in the Army. That led to the 77 Basic Rules Edition and the 81 Revised Basic Rules Edition, and the rest is history. As it turns out, Wesley did make it home, and as of 2022, is still running wargames at gaming conventions. And that's the story of dice. Now you know why you know what they are.